Well, good morning. When we have a sunny sea day and it's the last day before everybody gets off the ship, I always know that this is the faithful few. So thank you very much for showing up. I really appreciate that. You already know me, so we can skip that. But I thought what I would do is I always like to show you a little bit of the photography that I took along the way. So here are some pictures. They're much sharper on the side of places that we visited. Here's another one. Maybe you recognize those little boys from the school children that were at the presidential palace. That was really fun. And of course, we went to the pagoda. And then if you got up early this morning, you saw this. You have to be on the deck at 6:30 in the morning, though, so maybe you didn't quite see that one. But anyway, it was a nice sunrise for the last day of the cruise. So let's talk a little bit about Singapore, okay? And Singapore is really the result of one man's real dream and effort and control over an island that had been back and forth between various sultanates and federations. When he got control, he really changed the way that Singapore looks and the way it acts today. So we're going to talk a little bit about how it got there, and then what you will see and what you won't see when you get off the ship as a tourist, okay? So let's start with the other side of the bridge. As you know, Singapore is connected to the mainland, Malaysia, by a bridge. Have any of you ever crossed that bridge? Yeah, so you know the traffic is terrible, and you have to go through security and all this kind of stuff. And what you realize is that every day, thousands of people from Malaysia come across that bridge to work in Singapore and then go back every evening because they can't afford to live in Singapore and they aren't allowed to live in Singapore, which is an interesting kind of thing that helps us start to realize how different Singapore is from its roots, which were in Malaysia. All right, so there's a picture of what it looks like on the other side of the bridge and what it looks like on the Singapore side of the bridge. A radical difference in economics, in culture, in history, just over that one little bridge. And so what we want to know is, why did that happen? Why is it that Malaysia is so radically different than Singapore? So we have to go back. Before Singapore became the economic colossus of Southeast Asia, it was just a trading port. And it was a trading port under a sultanate. You can see here that it shows you the area that the Muslim sultanate controlled. And Singapore was nothing more than a small trading port, obviously connections to trade around Southeast Asia. But the official language was Malay, and it was part of the sultanate that controlled that whole area. It split off in 1528 to join another sultanate, the Johor Sultanate, and that was because Portugal, one of the European colonizers, attacked the original sultanate, and the sultanate was split over who was going to be supporting of Portugal and who wasn't. Okay? And the result was that one of the consequences of that split was that a man named Stamford Raffles, who was a British citizen, but who was the governor of the Dutch East India Company, really got involved in negotiating a British trading port with the Johor Sultanate. And as a result of that, you can see the date, 1818, he completed a negotiation which allowed the British to start using Singapore as a trading port for British ships. And in 1824, he signed a treaty that basically allowed Britain to have control of the entire island. Remember, the island isn't anything more than just basically a swamp and a river and some trading docks and ports. But the British got involved, and the population went, and you can see the numbers there, the population went from 1,000 to 80,000. Well, where do those people come from? the British brought the people from China to work the economics of this new trading port. So they imported a Chinese population into what was a Malay original indigenous people, and they did that in order to expand their economic enterprise. And in 1867, the island actually became a British crown colony. It was separated from its Muslim origins and now is established as a British crown colony separate from the Sultanate. The strategic location of Singapore then made it important not only for trade but for military purposes, and you will see why in a second. And you can see what will happen on this choke point. So here is the choke point, right here, right? And this actually is a digital image of the actual ships crossing these seawaters in, I think the date on this one is 2017. But you can see the line, those lines basically represent, each dot of those lines represent a ship in transit. And you can see the choke point right where Singapore is, right? Otherwise, you got to go all the way around the Indonesian islands in order to get back to the eastern or the Middle Eastern bloc of Saudi Arabia and up to the Suez Canal. Okay, so it becomes strategically important for business, for economics, and it also becomes militarily important because it controls that little tiny strait, controls what happens to most of the shipping lanes that come from the eastern coast of China and down around into the Middle East. In 1865, Singapore was like this, and you can see here that it's basically a very small town on the edge of a river, okay, in 1865. But something happens that changes all of that. Japan. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, they did that in order to determine whether or not the West was capable of resisting their efforts to control all of Asia. And what happened is, of course, you know the story. The Japanese were successful in their invasion of Manchuria, and as they spread across Asia in order to have control, they discovered how much the West would resist and how much they had to deal with the military power of the West. You'll notice that Churchill called Singapore the Gibraltar of the East. So when the Japanese successfully conquered Singapore, and we'll talk about that in a second, that made them confident that they could take over the entire Pacific because they were able to defeat the British Navy in Singapore and actually captured Singapore and occupied Singapore. So after a 7-day battle for Singapore, Singapore basically was defeated by the Japanese. Churchill noted that it was the worst disaster in British naval history. Okay? And what happened is that they captured 55,000 people, soldiers. They killed 5,000 of them. Thousands of Chinese were killed by the Japanese, which, as you've gone on this cruise, you must have noticed. We started in Japan. You've noticed what happened in Japan after the war, how spectacularly efficient it is. And you should have also noticed the cultural animosity left over between the Chinese and the Japanese. You won't see it so much today because we're another generation past the original people who felt that the impact of Japan in their lives, the Chinese and the Malaysians. But if you look at the history, you'll find it. And we're going to see some of that history in Singapore. So, Japan decided it could win the war in the Pacific as a result of this battle. And they created a prison camp at Changi, which, you know, the airport in Singapore is called the Changi International Airport. And it's because the prison was located in the same, very near the same area. In fact, if you have time, you can go to a war memorial at Changi, and you can see the actual prison that the soldiers were kept in, and I can tell you that it was brutal. Many of them starved to death. They were certainly not treated well under the Japanese rule. And the result of that is that 35,000 Brits and 15,000 Australians were held in captivity there. And if you go to that memorial, you will actually see the results of what happened under Japanese control. And it was a serious impact to the development of the British idea of having control in Southeast Asia, and it had a really huge impact in what happened in the rest of the war. So after 1945, things changed. In 1945, immediately following the surrender of Japan, there was a complete breakdown in the society in Singapore because the infrastructure was destroyed. There were food shortages, there was violence, there was no unifying government. Basically, it was leftovers of a prison camp. And the result of that was that the people were under enormous pressure just to survive, and it caused all kinds of administrative corrections to what was happening in Singapore. And the Chinese communists were involved in a push to go from China down through the rest of Asia. So Singapore was granted, under the provisions of the defeat of the Japanese, was granted self-rule. But by 1959, that wasn't working well at all. There were all kinds of riots and shortages of everything. And so the Malaysian government decided that they wanted to reunify Singapore. Remember, it had been a British crown colony. So they wanted to bring Singapore back into the Malaysian Federation in order to bring some stability to the Singapore area. And they did that by a referendum. The interesting thing about the referendum is that there was no alternative to it, right? So the referendum only had one option. The referendum succeeded, and it created the Malaysian Federation that brought Malaysian control back into Singapore. But remember, the British had imported 80,000 Chinese to work in Singapore, so now it's under Malaysian control, and the big question is, what do you do with the Chinese? If China's Communist Party is pushing south and creating all kinds of issues politically and militarily, what do you do with the 80,000 or more now Chinese that are actually in this island that's now a part of the Malaysian Federation? Well, things don't work out very well. Indonesia objected to the Malaysian Federation because by the time the Federation was in place, there were terrorist bombings going on all the time in Singapore. They killed a lot of people in the bombings, and it went on for many years. We don't realize how little time has passed since there was basically a guerrilla civil war going on inside of Singapore. The result of that is that Singapore, under the Federation, objected to the trade restrictions that Malaysia put on it. And there were money disagreements over promises of loans that were made to rebuild the structure of Singapore, loans that were never completed because of the conflict that was going on. And you can see in 1964, not so long ago, right? Riots occurred between the Chinese and the Malaysians. And that's because basically the Chinese and the Malaysians had two separate cultures and two different religions built into the same society. Right? So the Malays were Muslim, and the Chinese were either Confucian or Buddhist, and the result of that was a huge conflict, not just of economic issues, but of ideological issues. And as a result, 80% of the population of Singapore was Chinese, but they were under the rule of the 20% of Malaysia. So eventually, the Malaysian Federation decided we can't deal with this anymore, and they expelled Singapore from the very federation that they had tried to make for unification. So now Singapore is on its own, and fortunately, a man shows up who changes everything about Singapore, right? Referred to as LKY. the first prime minister of Singapore as an independent colony, an independent nation now, removed from the Malaysian Federation, no longer a British colony. LKY, he's the man with the dream, and he decides that he's going to make Singapore an economic capital of Southeast Asia. So he supported economic expansion. He supported limited freedoms under government control. Remember that, because when you get off the ship in Singapore, you're going to see the results of LKY's decisions, but what you will not see is the limited freedom that the citizens of Singapore have in order to make this possible. Okay? So, an amazing growth, 8% a year for 20 years. And that created a financial industry, a shipping industry, a technology industry, under all of these government restrictions that basically promoted everything that developed the prosperity of Singapore at the cost of some individual freedoms. The People's Action Party, which remained in absolute power until 2011, not so long ago, finally suffered its worst political defeat, but it still controlled 70% of the parliament. And now there's a new election coming up, or there was a new election in 2020, and they lost some more seats. So something is happening in the political environment in Singapore that's beginning to shift the massive growth under control project into something else. And in my opinion, that's almost inevitable. So what happens is this. The people are willing to accept the government restrictions on their individual freedoms because it means prosperity. And the kind of growth that happened in Singapore could not have happened if you had every individual with his own quote-unquote rights. Okay? It had to happen under the control of LKY, who was virtually an economic dictator. Okay? But the growth was phenomenal. And now you've reached a point where everyone who's able to live there has a great deal of prosperity, and all of a sudden, prosperity promotes complacency. And when you start thinking about how much you have, you stop thinking about how much it took to get there. And now and so the result is the government now has to deal with people who believe that they're entitled to that and want their freedoms back. And that's what's happening with the political party. Yeah, you have a question?
Yes, I feel like you skipped something with going into LKY. What happened to the religious differences and the Chinese?
What happened to them, sorry?
What happened to the religious differences that were occurring and the Chinese population?
Okay. I'm so glad you asked, because here it is. Okay. So what happened is, So what happened is, on the surface, it looks like an enormously prosperous place. But underneath it is not only this religious tension, which we're going to talk about in 1 second, but the way that Singapore is able to maintain its prosperity, not because the Singaporeans are the ones who are underneath the infrastructure keeping it all going, but because Singapore uses imported foreign workers who they control through passport control and by the way, don't pay the same wage to, in order to maintain the prosperity that's built on top of the structure that comes from the work of someone else. Okay? So, how do you keep it beautiful? You control the passports of the people who come to work. So they can't actually change a job. They can't decide when they're going to leave. They're under a contract, right? Basically, they have no ability to act as individuals in the community because they're controlled by whatever contract they have that gets them into the country. You have enough regulations to maintain the prosperity and the look of prosperity, and that encourages encourages wealth. And the result is, I'll give you an example. There's a rule in Singapore that says that you cannot drive a car that's more than 10 years old. You're required to basically trade your car, which then, by the way, those cars go across the bridge into Malaysia, and you have to have a new car, or you face severe fines, and eventually you will not be able to drive at all. If you have an antique car, you can pay an enormous fee in order to have that car. But essentially what that means is when you go to Singapore, you're going to see all new vehicles. And that is an example of the kind of regulation that keeps Singapore at the economic level where it is, right? You don't have a choice over this. The same thing happens with taxes and housing. You are assigned housing. You'll see lots and lots of high-rise apartments, and in order to move from one apartment to another, you have to fulfill or fill out forms that require you to justify the change, because the government has control over the housing market, except for, of course, the very wealthy. Okay, and that means that there are lots of really interesting kinds of restrictions that go on when you visit there. For example, don't plan on flagging down a taxi, because a taxi can't stop except in the places where there are taxi provisions for taxis, okay? So that's just one small example of how the government has regulated the operations of people in the system to maintain the kind of environment that allows them to have streets lined with flowers. By the way, all the people who are working on making sure the flowers are there are probably not from Singapore. That they have an enormously efficient electrical system, and I've seen all the workers who are under the streets working on all that, and they're not from Singapore. And that they have this huge foreign population coming across the bridge every day to maintain all of the, what we'd call low-level jobs that keep Singapore going. Okay, and of course, there's the hidden side of Singapore as well. So what is the hidden side of Singapore? I run a charity in Jakarta, Indonesia. And that charity basically supports children who are born to prostitutes who are abandoned on the streets. The reason that I'm supporting that is because I met a woman in Singapore who was abducted from Jakarta and taken to Singapore and forced into sex trafficking while the police and the administration knew all about it, but did nothing to prevent it because it keeps business going. And that side of Singapore you will not see as a tourist, but it's there. And it works in order to keep all of the process going underneath the system that supports the people who make enough money to change all of the exterior of the system. So Singapore is kind of a dual society. On top of that, Singapore has a serious, I want to talk about your question, but let's first take a look at what that means in terms of Singapore's cost of living. So I've done a little comparison here. You probably can't see it back there because it's not really in good focus. But let's talk about the difference between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, right? Consumer prices in Singapore, 136% higher. Consumer prices including rent, 218% higher. Pricing of Singapore rent, 475% higher in Singapore than in Kuala Lumpur, okay? Restaurant prices, 156% higher. Grocery prices, 89% higher. You thought inflation was bad in the West. Try moving from Kuala Lumpur to Singapore. Unless you have a lot of money, you're talking about 2 or 3 times the income just to survive. And you thought Tokyo was expensive. Well, Singapore prices, consumer prices, are 42% higher than Tokyo, right? And they're 78% higher for rent. And they're restaurant prices are 60% higher, grocery prices are 12% higher. The only thing that's different is that the local purchasing power in Singapore is 11% lower than in Tokyo. So if you want the most expensive city in Southeast Asia, Singapore is your option, right? Often we think of Japan as really, really expensive, but you have no idea how expensive it actually is to live in Singapore until you see these kinds of comparisons. Why is that? Oh, let me see if no. Why is that? Because as I said, there's two societies in Singapore, one that's underneath that supports all this so that the economic value at the top of the society can be basically unrestrained and grow like crazy. And the second is your question about the conflict between the Chinese and the Muslims. And you're going to see that in vivid relief if you spend any time at all in central Singapore, because you'll have a Hindu temple on one street and a Chinese temple on another. You'll have a Muslim mosque on one street. In fact, one of the tourist locations is a mosque. And you'll have a Chinese Confucian or Buddhist temple on the next street. And that conflict has created a real ideological religious tension inside the society. So what typically happens is that the vast majority of the Chinese are in the lower part of the economic structure, and both economics and religion cause this rift. As I said, in 1964, there were riots about all this. They keep it under control now, but it's always present because the population roots are so different, right? The Malays and the Chinese have been in struggle with each other for a long, long time. And in Singapore, they have to live side by side to create the economy to make it work. And the result is, excuse me, the result is this incredible tension inside the society. When you get off the ship, you will meet lots of Chinese, and you will occasionally run across a Malaysian as well. And of course, you'll find foreigners there. But what's really interesting is you should talk to whoever your taxi driver is, or your tour guide, or somebody in the restaurant, and ask them, what's it like to live here? And they will begin to tell you, maybe, about the tensions that they feel as a result of this conflict of culture, which doesn't go away. It doesn't get syncretized, because you have family connections to the systems of the culture that you came from, and they maintain those kind of connections in spite of the fact that they all live in the same place. It's like a perfect example of how multiculturalism does not lead to unification, right? And you'll see that in Singapore. It's really an amazing, interesting cultural experience. Parts of Singapore are certainly Chinese, and parts of Singapore are not. And by the way, there is a good Indian population there as well, as I mentioned, the Hindu temples that you'll see. And so all of those cultures together form this really amazing amalgamation where you can literally walk from one street to the next and change culture in the process. It's really quite fascinating. So here are some things that you will want to see. The botanical gardens, of course, are amazing. And here's an example. I mean, it's high tech everywhere in Singapore. You have a good time walking around inside of a jungle forest under a glass canopy. And you can see those towers in the back, which we're going to take a look at in a second. I'm sorry? No, that one's a clip from a movie, but these are my photographs. So now you're going to see China, the Buddhism of China, and the Hinduism of India side by side in Singapore. And it's really fun to do that because you'll just go from one culture to another, one kind of food to another, one basically dialect to another, all within a few blocks of each other. And of course, you'll do the tourist attractions. There's the really interesting pillars of high-tech botanical stuff. And here's, of course, one of the big religious areas, and then the famous casino that looks like a boat on top of 3 towers, right in the harbor. And of course, if you go to the colonial area, you'll find some really, really beautiful photographic opportunities because the British colonial system that built all of that area is still present there. And you can discover all these really incredible Chinese and British homes in one block after another. And you'll want to make sure that you take the right kind of taxi. So here's an example of all the taxis and a little bit of humor. The guy with the backpack of Mao on his back, which, by the way, is allowed in Singapore as a tourist. Right? Yes? I'm sorry, what?
What is the current political system? Do they have a dictator?
What is? Oh yeah, the current political situation is still the same process. The governmental parliamentary process of elections, but the one who becomes the prime minister has lots of control over what has happened. And now Singapore has established basically a pattern, a routine that will keep it, moving at this great growth rate. Okay, and finally, something about the traffic. This is Singapore, by the way. You can go to this square. Yes. And you'll notice there were no old cars at all. Okay? So, yeah, Singapore is, this movie was one of the few movies that's actually shot in the center of Singapore. That's why I like the clip. And of course, Singapore is a fascinating place. So you'll have a really great opportunity if you're getting off the ship and staying a few days to go to the Changi Prison War Memorial, to visit some of the Indian culture and some of the Chinese culture and the Buddhist culture that's there, to see the colonial part of the city. If you're just getting off for the day, take a tour and go around. They'll take you to all these places. And I wouldn't miss the botanical gardens. There are 2 of them. One is an outside garden, which you saw the little wooden bridge that takes you, and it has beautiful, beautiful orchids. And then there's the inside garden, inside the big glass structure, and it has botanical plants and flowers from every part of the world. According to the area, it's all all environmentally controlled on the inside, and it's really a beautiful place. Lots and lots of really fascinating stuff. But don't forget that you're walking through at least 3 different or 4 different cultures: the Chinese, the Malaysians, the Indians, which are present, and then the foreign workers who are underneath it all, keeping it all going. Yes, sir? What is the dominant language? Either Chinese or English. You won't have any problem with English at all. But the local population, since it's mostly 80% Chinese, will probably speak Mandarin. Okay? So you can start off with ni hao and see how you do, right? Yes? Everyone speaks English, yes. Yes. Except when they're talking to each other. And then, yeah. Yes. Singapore is one of those places where economics and education go hand in hand. So there's a dominant theme of education. But remember that because of the government controls of the whole process, the education system will bring you up to university or college skill level, but then you still have to figure out how are you going to work? Where are you going to work? And how's that going to happen in a system that regulates how the business environment works? But listen, it's not like the regulations that you would find in, say, Beijing, because in Singapore, it's all about the money. So if you don't disturb the society by doing something stupid, and you're there to increase the wealth of the society, you're going to find a very open environment. And that what makes Singapore such an unusual place, right? Just remember how new it is. It didn't even start on this path until 50, 60 years ago, right? So it's really changed a lot in the last generation. Yes, ma'am.
What is the ethnicity that holds the money?
The Chinese. Yes. But the Chinese is the vast majority of the population, too. So you'd expect that, right? Okay? But it's not the Chinese that you encountered. I don't know if you've been to Beijing or Shanghai. It's not the Chinese that you encountered in, say, in Nha Trang. But you remember, if you were on any of the tours in Saigon, how much they talked about, oh yeah, LKY came from Singapore to Vietnam, he saw what was happening, and he went back and said, this is what we want. But of course, he was able to do that in a different kind of way, so that the improvement that happened in Singapore was radical and very, very quick. Yes?
So was LKY Malayan, and how did he become leader?
Okay, so when the Malaysian Federation broke over the issue of internal violent struggle in Singapore, they basically let them go hands off, right? They separated from the Malaysian Federation, and they had an election. And LKY was elected as the first prime minister, but he's Chinese, and the population is Chinese, so that's what happened. Yes? No? Okay, so there's me. Thank you very much for joining me on all of these different lectures. I hope that you discover something about this wonderful area of the world. And if you have questions or you want to follow up on anything, that's my website, skipmoen.com, pretty easy. I will be on the next leg, and we'll talk about all the stuff between Singapore and Dubai, which is lots of fascinating things. But I just wanted to thank you for showing up today, and appreciate it very much.